Under Governor Janet Mills, Maine has become one of the most anti-Christian states in the nation. The anti-God political machine running the Pine Tree State seems bent on eradicating Christianity from the state.
I would never have imagined I'd be doing this, but you watch the world disintegrate around you and you realize you have the tools to fix it. We have a normalization of things that are fundamentally morally wrong. This is our moment. This is it. We either are equal to our time now, or we look forever backwards and say, why did I not step up?
Bobby Charles, I am so glad that you're here in the office today. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
A couple of things I want to talk about. One, congratulations on just securing after the primary. You are the front runner for the conservative and, might I say, the common sense Mainer coming in November, 4 months away. There's an uphill battle, certainly, that you have before you, but I'm confident that God has called you to this race. Would you agree?
I do. I feel called every day. I get up and listen closely and make sure I'm still being called. But, the reality is that several years ago, and let's say 3, I would never have imagined I'd be doing this. But you watch the world disintegrate around you and you realize you have the tools to fix it. It would be as if you had a doctor walking along a street and you see people with broken legs and you know you can set them. You do have a moral obligation to step up. And by the way, that's not just true of me, it's true of everyone. I personally think that, it's the way that my mother actually trained us kids when we were growing up. And, it wasn't just that we were in church every Sunday and had Sunday school. It was that we lived a life where she, despite having very little in life, if somebody needed something, she stepped up, and we watched that all the time. And so the average viewer, I guess I would just say, I'm going to bet you 2 to 1 there are people in your life that actually need you. We undervalue what we can bring to others. And I think what happened about 3 years ago with me is people started coming to me, won't name them, but multiple people saying, Bobby, look how blessed your life has been. You came from nothing. You were trained by World War II vets. You were given opportunities in life, and there is something owed back. And, you think you've paid it back, but maybe you haven't. Maybe what you've done is just the beginning of the process of paying it back, because actually you can never fully pay it back.
Sure.
So
I think what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is there has been a cry of desperation from Mainers saying our state is in a very bad way. And, just to kind of set the scene here before we have some conversation about how can change be brought to the state of Maine, here's just a few, news publication titles over the last few months. News Center Maine in March of this year, 2026, they had an article titled "Paganism's Popularity is Growing in the State of Maine." We had the Maine Monitor in January of this year. They titled their publication, "Maine is one of the least religious states in the United States." And then Liberty Counsel, which is out of Orlando, Florida, one of the prestigious law firms representing religious freedoms all over the nation. They fight at the Supreme Court level all the time. Liberty Counsel titled an article, "What on Earth is Going On in Maine?" And I quote, Matt Staver, the founder, said, "Under Governor Janet Mills, Maine has become one of the most anti-Christian states in the nation. In fact, Liberty Counsel has sued this particular governor more than any other governor in the union. The only state we have sued more in our 35-year history is California. The anti-God political machine running the Pine Tree State seems bent on eradicating Christianity from the state." So let me ask you, Bobby, you get the Blaine House in November. How then does public policy in Augusta need to be reformed, and how can we reshape the political landscape that is happening here in our state?
So in a word, it needs to be reformed dramatically. Policy does affect culture. Poor leadership or leadership in the wrong direction affects culture. What you're describing, what those headlines describe, is the disintegration of the moral fabric that always defined Maine. We were a hardworking state. We were an other-regarding state, to borrow from the old philosophers. We were a state that actually was grounded in our Christian beliefs. We had Jewish community here. We had all kinds of communities here, but we were very much a state that understood what I'll call the true north needle on the moral compass. And while we all oscillate and the needle bounces here and there, we knew where we were headed. When you get policies that that fly directly in the face of both biblical teachings and common sense, you should take notice, and you should say, listen, even if you're not well learned in the Bible, something is happening here that is dramatically changing the way that the world around you is going to treat you, your kids, everybody else. So we can go down through the list, and actually almost every policy position that I advocate has a moral component. And I'll just give you the quick list off the top of my head. When you talk about property taxes being out of control, you might say, well, what does that have to do with anything to do with morality? Actually, it has a lot to do with morality. What happens is we're now treating our elders, the seniors in this state, and we have a lot of seniors in this state, as if they didn't matter. They're losing. I go to events and they're losing their homes. It's not just theoretical. I was at an event a week ago. This older couple, lost their home because they for lack of $4,000. And so what you've done is you've become, if not instantly immoral, you become amoral in the way that you look at the well-being of both seniors and young people. Young people are leaving this state in record numbers. And the reason is they cannot afford housing. They do not see a secure environment around them. And then just to tick through the rest, income taxes, same moral component. If you are essentially robbing people of money that they earned to spend it on things like pushing boys into girls' sports and doing a whole bunch of other things that have no bearing, in fact, are directly corrosive of the moral fiber. So, and the same thing is going to be true of all the rest of my positions. I mean, we can talk later about drug policy and drug traffickers and addiction treatment and the fact that our energy costs are out of control. All of these things are policy decisions that have taken us in the wrong direction. So I will tell you, when you push policies that take you in the wrong direction, the culture of the state begins to change. And the culture of the state is a rough way to say the combined moral conviction of the individuals that make up the state. Of course, we've had a lot of people come into the state, illegal aliens by the thousands, and a lot of people that showed up that said, hey, we love Maine, but now we want to change you. So they've pushed us away from the Norman Rockwell values, away from the World War II values that I grew up with. But I think the point I would just make to you is when I get there, the entire table gets reset in a way that I think 2 years into my administration, even what I'll call traditional Democrats and traditional unaffiliated voters are going to look around and say, wow, I voted that guy in on a random chance that he might turn the place around. But isn't it great that there are no needles anymore all over our streets? Isn't it great that our kids now feel a binding force and ability to stay in the state and live nearby? What about how about the fact that our school system now actually is beginning to teach kids the things that make them successful in life instead of garbage and making excuses for moral depredation? And how about the fact that we're going to get rid of that fraud? He's impaneled grand juries. We did a funny little piece. I'll just end with this. We did a funny little piece on social media, kind of a newsreel, as if we were 2 years into the administration. And ironically enough, I don't think there's anything objectionable in the entire reel. We had conservative, I'll call them conservative, but traditional Democrats and unaffiliated voters looking at the reel and going, man, I sure hope that is really what happens, because that's the state I want to live in. I don't want to live in the state.
You're spot on. In other words, morality is involved in all of these areas that maybe on its surface don't seem like they're moral issues. I mean, we are sitting right here in Westbrook in the upstairs office here at the church at Calvary Chapel. A few miles down the road, we have the Gorham Public Library, where 2 months ago there was an adult 250-pound man dressed as a woman with a bunch of blacked out windows so cameras couldn't see. 2 miles down the road, the other way, right on Congress Street in Portland, is Planned Parenthood, where now in our state you can kill a child up until the day that child is born. So we're seeing Maine is in a dire need, as you just made mention of. We need to see change. I want to talk about what you just referenced concerning the corruption, especially at a high level. Steve Robinson, John Featherston at the Maine Wire have done incredible investigative journalism, uncovering a lot of this corruption. And no one, when I say no one, I mean Aaron Fry, the Attorney General, Shanna Bellows, the Secretary of State. No one has been held accountable for the multi-million dollars that have been ripped off and corrupted. How do we see that? If you become the governor, how can that be turned around?
So as a former federal investigator and former federal litigator, I'll give you a complex but quick description of what we will end up doing. I want to stop, though, and wind back 30 seconds and say, you asked the question, or you describe a state that is in free fall when it comes to their ability to even find the horizon for some kind of a moral norm of the kind that we used to have. And I'm reminded of the words of Edmund Burke years and years ago, who said that all it takes for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. And so what I see happening in this state is that weakness begets weakness begets weakness. And so we have no leadership in the right direction. We have no one standing up and saying the things I'm saying. They're very straightforward things to say. We need to protect our kids.
Yeah.
We need to be able to afford life. We need to be able to be safe on our streets. We need to be able to believe in the integrity of our state government. These are not complicated or even controversial things. These are things that the average Mainer 20, 30 years ago all believed were happening.
Yeah.
And so what's happened is, I will get to the investigative side, but what we've done is we've entrusted our future to a group of leaders, the Democrat-controlled legislature, Democrat constitutional officers that you just mentioned, actually a Supreme Court all appointed by Democrats, DAs in this state except one who are all Democrats. We've entrusted our future, vested trust in people who have betrayed that trust. And we're only now, because we're a very trusting people, Maine people, we're only now beginning to wake up and go, you know what? That's completely wrong. I don't want that to be the future for my state. I don't want that to be the future for my kids. So on the investigative side, the numbers and articulating the problem is always a good start for finding the solution. Articulating the problem, we do have a governor who won't talk about all the things that are, frankly, ailing the state and ailing the people of the state. Everything from, I've never heard the drug issue, Chinese grow houses, or any of this come out of her mouth. She doesn't talk about the fraud. She doesn't talk about the rest of this. She just wants to be, she hates Donald Trump. So this is her whole platform. I'm going to just meet him in court and create a bunch of chaos and hope you pay attention to the shiny things over here while I do all these other things over here that are bad. But, and I'll also say, even at the governor's level, she has fundamentally, I would love to debate that woman one-on-one or one-on-five with all the Democrats, because they have fundamentally run our ship up on the rocks. They are responsible, and you can actually draw a straight line between each of these policy issues that's a failure and their decision making, whether it's the executive branch, executive orders, or it's with the legislature. On the investigative side, and just again to articulate the problem, we have 6,500 non-compete sole source contracts that were given to friends and family on the public record due to the FOIA requests that Steve Robinson and The Wire put out there. We have clear, normalized corruption in the form of contracting.
This is theory. This is hard.
Very hard facts, and they're above the threshold. So that involves corruption on two ends. Just so you get that clear, you have the individuals who are doing the procurement at the direction of political officers are on their own, freelancing to give this money that is taxpayer money away to their friends and family and affiliates. But you also have recipients of that money. So, and then a lot of this has gone to so-called nonprofits. We have 9,000 nonprofits in this state. If only 5% of them are as corrupt as Gateway and some of the 13 different contracts that were bundled with that one, if only 5%, then we're talking about 450 nonprofits that are taking money, not delivering services, but rather taking taxpayer money. That's just one little piece. Now go over here to things like the drug issue, which we can talk about more. But they've literally indulged the criminality. They've downfunded and demoralized police forces at the federal, state, and local level. They've adopted the concept of sanctuary state status, which of course essentially elevates the protection of illegal aliens over the protection of citizens. They've cut off the communication and been very aggressive about it between federal law enforcement, ICE, DEA, the people who are trying to keep us safe, and the state and locals. So there's another corruption issue. We have legislators. I would tell you that a big chunk of the Democrat leadership of the legislature are culpable in corruption. I'll give you an example. There's this Maddie Doherty, who's the head of the Senate, who somehow unbelievably gave herself had the government give her a forgivable loan for $500,000 for her 3-person brewery. Now, how many Mainers, by the way, got that during the COVID era? She also gave that money to herself after taking PPP money from the federal government, and the law says you can't take state money after federal money. So we have what's happened in this state, Travis, and it is a travesty. Okay, is that we have a normalization of things that are fundamentally morally wrong. And when the leadership showcases moral, not just moral errors in judgment, but a comfort level with moral depravity and a comfort level with taking of people's money and giving it to themselves. You now have a government that is thoroughly untrustworthy and that is in need of major revision. So to the point of your question, what I will do is I will showcase something completely different as a governor. I'll not just showcase what it means to live or to lead as a Christian, but I will showcase the idea of policy choices that empower the average individual against the state. I will sign bills that limit the governor's power. I will work with the legislature to roll back unfunded mandates. I will literally work with the attorney general, God willing, we get the legislature to get impaneled grand juries that then do felony referral. I'll do felony referrals. We'll do convictions. If there's a nexus with the federal government, we'll get the FBI in here. So the short point is, you always have, to borrow from Robert Frost, when there's a fork in the road, there's the path less traveled and the one more traveled.
Right.
We've been on a more traveled path that is filled with corruption, betrayal of trust, and we need to get we need to go down the path of being trustworthy.
Well, you made a good point there, because a lot of people probably do not know this. In fact, this is something I recently it was Trey Stewart who taught me this, that Trey Stewart, a godly man, obviously the Senate minority leader, and he's the one that told me that Maine is one of the few states in the union where, as far as the attorney general or secretary of state, those are chosen by the legislature.
Yes.
So, I at the beginning of our interview together, I said there's a bit of an uphill battle for you in the sense of when you get, Lord willing, the Blaine House, the governor's seat, you still need allies. You need to see a majority in either or both the Senate and the House of Representatives, which right now Maine has not seen in some time. But yet they're very, very close.
Yes.
The conservative majority is only a few seats away in both the House and in the Senate. So there needs to be a team working of local voters. I think so often Mainers focus on what's happening in D.C. and they forget what's happening in their own town.
Yeah, so very good point.
So how do we do this? How do we try and get voter apathy? This is something that many on your campaign, I've talked to Dale Crafts about this, of wanting to say there is a whole lot of unenrolled Maine voters. They're not voting, and yet they need to. How do we address this?
So to that specific point, I believe we have the moral majority in this state, as in to say, I think there's 75% of this state that knows that things are just headed in the wrong direction. In fact, they just did a big poll in this state, which is bipartisan, that says that 89% of independents think the state's on the wrong track. So that tells you everything you need to know. Everything that I'm talking about, you're talking about, this isn't about conservatives. This is about everyday people who understand that the moral compass needle is spinning and we got to get control of it or we're going to run up on the rocks. So what you do is you go out and we need to register voters that are very upset but have not been part of the political process. In our last cycle here, just the primary, we had near record turnout for Republicans. We had a lot of Democrats and independents who actually changed their registration to Republican in order to vote. I look forward to talking to more and more people, particularly in the southern part of the state, who are either independents or Democrats who are very disaffected. So the first thing you do is you register. And by the way, the pool of registrants, the pool of people that we can register, is actually much bigger than people realize. A lot of people have been so disaffected by the political process that they just said, I just checked out. Okay. But I'm going to include in that group what I used to call the Harry Truman JFK Democrats, but it's also the Harry Truman JFK, now it's Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton Democrats. They have no home. The Democrat Party at large has become progressive, and Hannah Pingree and Rick Bennett are essentially now progressive, and also so are all those other candidates. So the first thing we do is we register new voters. The second thing we do is we get those voters to the polls. And actually, it's one thing to register, it's you signed up to play in the game, but we need to get you to get off the bench and go into the game and play, because this is your future. And if we don't get it this cycle, we're going to wish we had. The last thing I'll say is a governor, once you get there, there's a lot of things you can do. And there are several things I think I can do that are out-of-the-box things that most governors have not thought about doing, because, frankly, Republican governors haven't been in this terrible spot prior to now. One is that there's a gray zone. As a former litigator, I was a federal litigator. I was also a clerk on the U.S. Court of Appeals. I taught law at Harvard. One of the things that people don't realize is you've got the executive branch and the legislative branch, without bumping my microphone here. And in the middle, there's a gray zone. And one of the things that Ronald Reagan did and that Donald Trump is doing is they pushed the executive gray zone over. So they've argued, for example, who says that the 14th Amendment decision on birthright citizenship, which has been the law, is absolutely unequivocally the law? It was never, who says that includes illegal aliens? That needs to be relitigated. I'll give you lots of things. The Title IX question in the state of Maine.
Right.
Actually, the human rights law in the state of Maine is not superior to the supremacy clause in the Constitution that says that civil rights will be applied from the federal level down, and even things like ranked choice voting. We have a decision out there on ranked choice voting that was decided by the Maine Supreme Court that says that even though the Constitution says our governor will be picked by a plurality in the general election, the flow down in the primaries can be done in any other way. We could flip a coin. Actually, that's not what the founders said.
Yeah.
The founders of the state and of the country said, no, a plurality or a majority. And so the Democrats tried to redefine the word plurality. That's, again, an Orwellian move. We need to get back to basics. So as a governor, one of the things with executive orders I can do, whether I have the legislature or not, is I can push that gray zone and say, these are things that the people want.
Yeah.
And we will assert them through executive orders. You can challenge them, but eventually, over that 4-year block, I will have the ability to appoint different, actually perhaps all of the Supreme Court members who are all basically Democrats now. We can put constitutional conservatives there. And when someone sues me or sues the state, like the ACLU, it can bounce up and then it'll bounce right back down again. And the last thing is a governor has to constantly be working with the legislature. I've worked as a guy that ran big chunks of the oversight committee at the federal level, did investigations from Waco to illegal immigration to defense inventory to all kinds of things, lots and lots of investigations. And we had subpoena power and a lot of other things. One of the things I can do is I can go to the legislature and basically shame them into doing the right thing. And I'll give you an example of just the last cycle where just a single example where that should have been done. But of course, Governor Mills doesn't care, and her knockoff, Hannah Pingree, doesn't care, and Rick Bennett doesn't care. There was a bill up that would have said that the House Oversight Committee, OPEGA, would have the right to look at the DHHS documents that showed why 150 kids died in state custody under foster care, a huge number, and just a disproportionate, hellacious, troubling number, okay? What we would have done at the federal level, my committee had full subpoena power, so we would have just subpoenaed those records. But that oversight committee in the legislature does not have subpoena power. So they literally brought a bill to the floor saying we believe that at least the oversight committee ought to see the facts so that we can fix this problem and not have Maine kids dying. The Democrats voted that bill down, like those three monkeys that put their hands on their ears and they're, see no evil, say no evil, speak, see no evil, hear no evil. And so what does that mean? It means they understand that bad things are happening to kids in the state of Maine, and they don't give a damn.
Right.
All right. And I find that morally repulsive.
I agree. It's interesting. You think about, the left, they love to rewrite history. They love to have revision on the laws. But the one thing they don't want to talk about is they don't want to talk about revival, spiritual revival.
True.
And you and I, just moments ago, were having this conversation. Our nation is no stranger to revival. You look at the 1960s, one of the greatest Jesus movements in modern history. When you look back in the late 1800s with George Finney in New York that swept up into Maine, revival is part of our story, especially here in New England.
Yes.
And yet there has been this corrosion.
Yes.
And so, let's share a bit about Christ-centered recovery, because you know as well as anyone that the fentanyl, the trafficking, the transnational organized crime that is happening, rural Maine has really been hit hard. It's been an epicenter, which started with the OxyContin, now has become the heroin, fentanyl. But yet there's something that's happening in rural America. I think of Calvary Residential Discipleship at Calvary Chapel, Bangor, in Orrington. I think of the Arise Addiction Recovery there in Machias.
Yes.
And introducing an addict to the person of Jesus Christ, stepping out of the way, say, hey, we don't need the state money, we don't need the federal money. Let the churches minister. What are your thoughts on that? How can that be something that if you become governor, we can put more onus to the churches to get involved with this epidemic of the drugs?
As infinitely hopeless as the situation often seems, I am infinitely optimistic that we can pull this together. As we all know, in life, sometimes you have to hit the bottom before you are able to look up and understand where you can go. And Maine is in that spot, okay? As a state, we're in that spot. again, a few of the data points that I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, that you've never voted. I do want you to vote, but I just want you to people just to absorb the facts.
Right.
This is a state of 1.4 million people. We have roughly 300 residential beds for treatment, but we're looking at a state that is wrestling at a minimum with 150,000 admitted addicted people.
Wow.
We're talking about literally 10% of all those over the age of 12 are addicted in the state of Maine. It's a horrific number. We had 8,000 overdoses last year. We had roughly 600 young people die. And we had a governor who did a press conference minimally and said, this is good news. We've been doing a good job, everything. No. You have thoroughly betrayed the family, the individual, the social compact that says you will protect your people. And so my argument on this issue is actually very complex. This is actually the issue that got me off the couch. This is the reason. At its heart, this was the very first reason that I decided to run for governor. I've spent my life working with prevention groups, treatment groups, not just churches, but others who have been able to produce results. I've worked with law enforcement. I see all of these things tied together. And I think if you're going to get on a virtuous cycle, a cycle that's sustainable, where you feel that your life has purpose and you can go forward, you have to address all those things. So as a governor, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to up-power law enforcement. All the fentanyl, all the meth, all the crack cocaine, all the other synthetics, all the foreign drugs that are coming into this state, the heroin, all of it comes into the state of Maine. It's not produced here in the state of Maine. It used to be way back when there were these mom and pop meth operators, but all this is now super labs coming into the state of Maine. Here is the killer fact. We know exactly where it's coming from. We know how it gets here. It comes up through Lawrence on Lowell on 95. There's a little bit that comes in the northern border. Most of it comes straight up 95. We could almost pick the cars I was an intelligence officer for 10 years, and I did a lot of work in the counter-narcotics area beyond that. We know exactly where it's coming from. We know the cars. We can stop it. So the first thing you do is you stop the supply. You stop the inflow. The second thing you do is you put real addiction services out there. You unleash the dogs, if you will. You let the churches go do this. You let the other parts of you go to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration in the federal government, and you work with them. You don't create hostility toward the federal government, which is what this governor and all these Democrats are doing. You say, no, we need your help, okay? We need millions of dollars to be brought into all 16 counties so that we can get a combination of really effective drug treatment, really effective mental health. We need your support. We need HIDA's, high-intensity drug trafficking area designation by the Office of National Drug Control. We need your help. And that addiction services piece includes getting at, so you eliminate the things that don't work. Needles don't work. Endless giving away of Narcan doesn't work. And you create a model of success. We know we don't have to reinvent the wheel. South Dakota does it. Lots of other states do it. You literally, okay, someone is victimized by or has found themselves addicted to fentanyl. What do? The first thing you do is you resuscitate them on Narcan. The second thing you do is immediately get them in detox, 3 to 5 days. Now you link them to residential treatment. We do not have residential treatment.
Not nearly enough.
Not nearly enough. We need to increase it by tenfold.
Right.
Okay. We need residential treatment that's real. We need the support groups around it. You then link at the end of an extended period of residential treatment. You then link them not only to sustainable support groups, but you actually and churches. But you go beyond that. You link them to employment training. You link them to affordable housing. You make them responsible for their own life.
Yeah.
And in effect, you make all of us, this is what's missing in the state of Maine. We've all deferred to the government for everything.
And fundamentally opposed. I mean, as opposed to just handing out free needles.
Right, exactly.
And as opposed to just handing out Suboxone and methadone.
Yes.
Let's have a little bit of an accountability and say we want to see people rehabilitated.
Yep.
There is a spiritual component involved in all these people. Certainly, you know my story. I've shared openly with you.
Yeah.
It was a relationship with Christ that found freedom for me and my wife and our church staff.
I want to bring something together,
Please do.
Travis. I want to put two things together here. The individual and the state.
Yeah.
We talk about revival and an awakening. We want the state to refine its mojo, refine its cultural strength, refine its belief in each other, its spiritual health, its political health, its economic health, okay? But that's exactly what we also want in individuals. There's such a thing as a revival in an individual, a personal. We need individuals who want to be their best selves, who understand that there are better ways forward than being homeless on the street, and there are better ways forward than ignoring those who are homeless on the street. We need to be our best selves as individuals, and if we do that, and this borrows from Abraham Lincoln, it borrows from Ronald Reagan, it borrows from the Bible. If we can each listen to our better angels and help others and get out there, which is what I wake up every morning to do with a full heart, as a servant's heart. I mean, if we can do that as individuals, this state could be the model for what a real revival, a real awakening in a people is all about. And people say to me, Bobby, this is so idealistic. I mean, you seem to think that people can actually master their own destiny with a combination of hard work and prayer. And
our founding fathers thought that.
Our founding fathers thought that. Of course we can do that.
Of course. Yeah, one of the things I was talking about with one of the gentlemen on your staff is, I'm part of a fellowship of churches. There's nearly 27 Calvary chapels in Maine, a wonderful, under the leadership of Ken Graves for 40 years.
Yes.
And we've seen something really special. We are seeing rural parts of America really respond to the teaching of God's word. But there's also a big gap. A lot of the evangelical churches, sadly, I think their pastors are under the belief that I can't talk on things that are quote unquote political. I don't want to step out of my bounds, so to speak. I think the misnomer of separation of church and state has been devastating.
Yep.
And how do we, as a governor, how can you communicate to those pastors or church folk who think that and say, listen, we need you to do your unapologetic preaching from the pulpit? How do you communicate to those types of pastors?
Yeah, so I think you have to use a combination of simple conversation, the law, and help explain the law to people, and then inspire people to understand, and I say pastors, but people in general, to understand that your greatest mission in life is to affect the largest number of people for the good that you can while you breathe. I'm reminded of an old missionary named Stephen Grillet who said something in one of his prayers like, I shall pass this way but once, Lord, help me to help all those that I can while I can, for I shall not pass this way again. And that has to be the attitude we all have. Whatever the IRS says, we need to imagine that the IRS is not our eternal judge. We have a different eternal judge. But I'll go a step further, and that is to talk about the law. The IRS rulings recently have made it crystal clear that 501(c) status or 4 status or 5 status is not in danger by you supporting a political position and even a political person, a political candidate, which is quite remarkable. It hasn't come to the Supreme Court yet, but what's basically been said is that you have an opportunity, you have a right, and I would even argue an obligation to go out there and to speak truth. And that doesn't mean that you sort of pull back the engine governor on your engine when it comes to speaking the truth about certain issues. No, you are fully entitled to speak the truth as a church. So I will tell you, Travis, as a governor, I would like to model what it means to be a good Christian governor. I would like to model what it means to be someone completely faithful to the Bill of Rights. I have read all the letters that I could get my hands on, hundreds of them written by Jefferson. He did write a letter to the Baptists saying that he perceived a need for the separation of church and state, but the Supreme Court of the United States has repeatedly talked about community standards, has repeatedly talked about the fact that, for example, a child can pray in a public school. That's fully authorized. So what we have to do is go back to what I'd call the Founding Fathers' understanding. The Founding Fathers did not want the state, and that meant a state as an individual colony or state, and the federal government at large, did not want them pushing a particular religion. In particular, they did not want them pushing Anglican Church of England ideas, okay? They also celebrated the idea of faith itself. They were virtually all Christian. They ranged from Baptists to Methodists to Congregationalists to, there's probably 10 or 12 different self-identifiers that they used, but they fully understand what they wrote as the creator and as they understood as the hand of providence in the life of the nation. By the way, so did Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War.
That's why they could say these truths are
self-evident. Exactly.
They're quite obvious.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so part of what I would say is we need to stop being hostile to those who come to the table with a full heart and faith in the spirit of our Bill of Rights and of our Declaration of Independence and all the Christian founders. We need to just stop being hostile to those of faith and start recognizing that as John Adams in particular said, but so did Ben Franklin, so did Madison, so did Monroe, so did Hamilton. They all said in their own way, this was a republic that was formed for moral people. It won't work if we do not have moral compass as a people. They said it in all kinds of ways. And so the thing is, if you feed garbage into the system, you're going to get garbage out of the system. We need to start feeding the strength of our individual souls, the strength of our own conscience, the strength of our own decisions into our state. And that in turn leads to a state that is well compassed, that works every day to help people. You know, I have conversations, Travis, and I'm sure you do, with Democrats and those that are hostile to me because they say, well, you identify yourself as a conservative, a common sense conservative. Okay, well, I'm not a conservative. And I say, well, what do you believe about things? What do you teach your children? What do you try to do as you treat other people in life? What do you do? And I'll tell you, 75 or 80% of this state, maybe more, are people who actually want a state that's responsive to the things they think are important in their conscience, but they have not had a governor that will advocate it. They have been shouted down in the legislature. We have a Secretary of State that literally ripped away 50% of the voting, the ability of people to vote for somebody that they wanted to. We have a state that has gone out of its way to be hostile to individual liberties, hostile to the First Amendment, hostile to the Second Amendment, hostile to the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the 10th Amendment, and to those of faith. And we just need to get back to common sense.
I agree, Bob. And one of the things that I think is most troubling is the same people who have been hostile to the common sense traditions and values have been very warming up, friendly, maybe even the term pandering. They've been pandering to some of the most hypersexualization of a culture, including kids, that I've ever seen. I mean, our state is really leading, sadly, in this area. I want to briefly, I'm going to have our producer, Devin, share a brief video, and it's going to show Hannah Pingree, it's going to show Rick Bennett, just last week, marching right in the middle of the Pride Parade. And again, this is not an issue. I know you and I agree with this. There are people that you know, that you care for, who identify as a homosexual. There are people in my life as well. This isn't a hating a person. It is rather, why do we need to get behind the hypersexualization of our culture? So let's share this video, and then I want you to respond to it.
Several candidates in both Maine's gubernatorial and U.S. Senate races marched in Portland's annual Pride Parade Saturday. Democratic gubernatorial candidate Hannah Pingree and U.S. Senate nominee Graham Plattner greeted hundreds along the route. This comes days after Pingree secured her nomination with about 56% of the vote, while Plattner received about 75% of the vote in the primaries. Independent candidate for Governor Rick Bennett also marched in the parade. He'll be facing off against Pingree and Republican nominee Bobby Charles in the general election in November.
All right. So what do you make of this?
So I actually saw clips from that parade that, so let me start this way. Most Mainers are concerned about completely different things from that. Okay? Most Mainers are very tolerant people. If they're Christian, they take to heart the idea that I try very hard not to judge my neighbor. I live my life the way I live my life, and I ask you to keep asking yourself, what does your conscience tell you? Whatever that is, that's how people live. They don't, and we grew up in a state where there was not judgment at every turn. Okay, but what do they care about? They can't afford their health care. They can't afford their home. Their kids are leaving. They can't afford their energy bills. These are the real priorities in the state. They don't want needles everywhere. They don't want all this. They don't want the drug traffickers everywhere. They don't want their schools to be indoctrinating kids in this kind of stuff. So I back up 3 steps in a very calm way and say several reactions to that video. First, I saw other parts of that parade, and I was revolted because it's not just the elevation of sexualization as the definition of what we should care about most in life. No, we should care about common sense values most in life. We should care about taking care of our fellow person most in life. We should care about maintaining the cultural environment that is supportive and et cetera. But it's more than that. I saw clips in that parade that just absolutely stunned me. There was a fat kind of guy walking down the middle of the parade in his underwear, doing this twerking thing as if he's having a sexual activity with these children on the side.
Children on the sidewalk.
I was in shock, and I thought, is this what Maine has come to? That we are celebrating someone who is perversely, almost nakedly showcasing his, I don't even know what to call it,
Yeah.
but his definition of what he thinks is important to children. This is not right, okay? It's not right on 10 levels, okay? We shouldn't be exposing kids to over-sexualization at the young age. They give them a chance to be children. Give them a chance to grow with their parents' guidance through the things that are uncertainties in life so that they can eventually develop. Everybody goes through adolescence. Everybody goes through all that disorientation. Let them have a family-centered life that allows them to not be influenced by all these bad influences.
Yeah.
Second, why are we talking about sexualization as the ultimate definer of someone? I would argue that your conscience probably should be your ultimate definer. I would argue that the way that you work to treat other people, your faith, your how you get up in the morning purposeful should be the way that you define what matters in life. And that, of course, flows up to all these policy decisions. If we're going to, anyway, last thing I'll say is I think that kind of thing illustrates to me that the state has really lost its way. I look at that, and part of me, I guess I look at it from two different perspectives. One part of it is it revolts me that this is what the Democrats think is the most important thing, the sexualization of society. I think there are far more important things, and I think we need to focus on them. But the other side of it is a side of me that looks at this through the lens of George Orwell or Aldous Huxley or these people who said, watch out because society will become way off course. They're going to go off into the pucker brush. And I say to myself, so we have a celebration of alphabet soup here,
Right.
basically things that people think that I'm a sexual minority of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kind of groups, and this we're going to do a parade for. I just was wondering, where's the heterosexual day parade? I missed where that was
Good point.
happening. Where's pride in but here's the point. I don't want that.
Yeah.
What I want is a return to a center of your focus, a center of gravity that is about conscience and common sense and getting people forward in their lives. Whatever somebody's sexual orientation, whatever that is, okay, they still need to be able to pay their bills. They still don't want to have to turn the energy down to 50 degrees in the middle of the winter in order to buy groceries. Or by the way, to pay taxes for people who are going to push boys into girls' sports. They want common sense again. And Travis, what we've done is that parade is just illustrative of how off-center everything is. We need to think about what really matters to people. Lower taxes, lower spending, no more waste, no more duplicity, no more duplication, no more being untruthful to the taxpayer about where their money's going. No more drug traffickers in the state, crime, illegal aliens, rewarding illegal behavior instead of rewarding law enforcement and rewarding people who are trying to help people get out of the trap of addiction. No more looking at our schools and imagining that when we're at the bottom of the country, because we're teaching things like that and we're teaching indoctrination and we're teaching, basically that you don't have to make any hard decisions in life, that's somehow right. No, we need to teach reading and math.
Yeah.
We need to teach science. We need to teach trades. We need to teach, go back to things like basic practical skills like home ec, okay?
right.
We need to just teach those things. And then finally, the fraud. You can do all the parades in the world, and to me, that's a distraction
I think you're right.
away from fraud.
That's the word I keep thinking of. It just seems so peripheral that we're
It
going to
is.
make that the center of any sort of campaign. Malcolm Muggeridge, the turn of the 19th century, he was the gentleman who was a British satirist, but also a really brilliant journalist. He says, there used to be a thought that if you stop believing in God, you believe in nothing. He goes, the truth is much worse. When you stop believing in God, you can believe anything.
That's right.
And so now, Google will tell us that there's 72 genders. And I mean, some of you keep using the term common sense. We need to return to just common sense, common biology. And let's talk about what really matters.
So let's go to that exact point, because this is just a distraction, this whole parade business. And I think it's an intentional distraction away from the mismanagement, misjudgment, misgovernance, and all the fraud that they've been committing.
Yeah.
But people get after me and say, Bobby, you are, when I keep referring to conservative common sense, or I refer to common sense as the ballast on the boat, that's what keeps the thing centered and upright instead of getting off to one side or the other. They say to me, well, boys and girls sports, it's not that big an issue. And I say, well, it is a big issue. My youngest is a girl who's 24. If that had happened in her high school, and she was a cross country runner, captain of her cross country team, I would have been irate because I would have been saying, I would have been in that principal's face. I would have sued him personally, okay? And I would have gone after the governor, because to push boys, even if it's just a potential,
Right.
but to push boys into showers and into bathrooms where my daughter has, it's not just her safety and on the sports field, it's her safety, it's her dignity, it's her privacy, it's her basic understanding. And, I find it stunning that liberals on the far left sort of progressive side, who are men or women, I find it both equally repulsive, don't seem to understand that the self esteem and the self-identity of a young girl growing up is dramatically affected by finding a man in her shower. I got an email the other day from a group of older women who teach younger women to swim in a local facility here. And there was a man who asserted that he was transgender, whatever that is, and he thinks he's a woman, and he went in fully naked in the shower. It had a dramatic negative effect on these young girls. And the women had to say, the older women were just aghast. They had to take these girls out. And so why is it now the fault? Why 15 years ago to have a full-grown male in a female shower on purpose, pushing himself in there, would have actually been a felony in this state. Yeah. Now, not to let that happen is considered discriminatory.
Isn't that shocking? I mean, I've got to meet Randy Liberty. Randy Liberty was a former sheriff, appointed by the governor to be the commissioner over the prisons. And sadly, back to this term pandering, there's so much pressure put on these people who I think have a moral conscience, but there's so much pressure where now they're letting biological males are now being housed with biological females in our state prison system.
And that is abhorrent. The fact that you could force a woman. So
yeah,
you have women's facilities for in prison where they have the opportunity to serve their time and get back out into society. You're pushing a male into their presence on a regular basis. Some of the things that these women have gone through,
right,
the traumas are just they're multiplied by putting a male in that facility.
For disaster.
It's a recipe for disaster. And I'll also go to one last point, because again, I come back to common sense, and I'll sort of turn my own volume down a little bit. I don't think this stuff requires a whole lot of passionate discussion. I actually don't. I think all it takes is dispassionate review of reason and text and fact. I did a deep dive now a couple of years ago trying to understand how, because I'm always trying to get into the mind of the far left person to understand what motivates them besides their hate of Donald Trump. Are they really bought into Marxism? Do they even know what Marxism is, which of course embraces atheism and concentration of power and suppression of liberties?
Destruction of the family unit.
Destruction of the family unit, destruction of property. Do they really know that they're doing this? And I thought maybe I can have a reasoned discussion with people just on the fact. So the two bodies of material that I looked at were, and I spent a chunk of time at it, all the genetic markers that separate a man from a woman, a girl from a boy, starting right in the womb. And it's fascinating what they are. My joints, the joints in your finger, versus a woman, they're different. There's a different distance between the joints, and no amount of hormones will ever change that. That's the God-given difference between men and women. And there's 40 of those genetic markers, and they range from sizes and shapes and distances and chemical and actually physical makeup of the person to a range of other things. And then I go to the Bible, and I looked at the Bible, and I said, okay, let's look at all of the bases upon which the biblical writers and all the divine inspiration in the book. Let's look at what they say. There's no part of the Bible that suggests that there are more than two genders. Okay. And so they mock me. I find it fascinating. I get mocked because the other day somebody pushed me hard and said, okay, so there are all these genetic markers that make the difference, but we can inject hormones. And I said, no. The genetic markers do not change with the hormones. You're dressing up a person in different physicality, but the physicality actually never changes from the origins. And then they said, well, all these biblical references, give me something that illustrates that God really. So I had a whole bunch, going back to Adam and Eve and all the rest, but I said in passing, because it just floated through my mind, I said, remember, Noah only chose 2 animals. He didn't say 27 versions, okay? Yeah. And they mocked me like, what are you saying? And I'm saying, there are not 27
There's
genders.
not.
There are really strong indicators
Sure.
that there are only 2.
And you know what, Bobby? It's really not that new of a thing. I mean, even in the Gospels, in Matthew chapter 19, there were those who tried to do the same thing with the Lord Jesus. And he says, as it was in the beginning, and he says, God made them male and female for the invention of marriage.
Yeah.
And so this is something that it seems like the enemy and that which is evil is always rearing her ugly head. But we have seen it a bit unchecked for a long time here in the state of Maine. So I know this. I know time is of the essence for you. Let's do this. There are those who are going to tune into this that maybe they find themselves in the unenrolled category.
Sure.
Maybe they're in the middle ground. Maybe they're not hardcore this side or that side. How do you appeal to a man or woman, a Mainer, who's in that category, who at least can look around and say, we have gone so far off from the common sense center? How do you appeal to that person to get your support this coming November?
So this is not only what I do and what I will do, but it's what I encourage everybody to do. The very first thing I do is I listen. And sometimes the things you listen to are someone who's they've watched or listened to something that they're reciting back to you, and they've parted a little bit with their own common sense, and they've parted a little bit with their own conscience, and they're not interested in, or they have forgotten some of the history or the things that they were taught as a child. They've also forgotten maybe what they thought of themselves as a child.
Yeah.
And so the very first thing I think you do is you have to understand that a governor who will listen, and I will listen. If you tell me you're pro-abortion, I'll listen. I'll then ask you to listen. And we'll have this rare thing in modern society called a conversation.
Yeah.
And so the first thing I'm going to do as a governor, you can walk up to me and converse with me on anything. You can advocate for Satan, and I will tell you why that is going to take you in a bad place. And I'm going to tell you what the alternatives are, and I'm going to tell you what the implications or consequences are. I'm going to ask you questions that will make you think. So one of the things I think a governor needs to do, and a gubernatorial candidate, is not just listen, but have an exchange of questions with a heartfelt set of answers and responses that turn on a switch in people. And we have people on the left and the right who have turned off the reasoning switch. I want the reasoning switch turned back on again. And I want to work with you to get it turned on so that the conclusions you come to are not mine. The conclusions you come to are your own. And I will tell you that in this state, if you go issue by issue, I find that unenrolled, and again, I'll call them more or less traditional Democrats, who I think do not have a home in the Progressive Party because they keep pushing ideology, they keep pushing the envelope further and further away from common sense. I think a lot of them, and I'll just go issue by issue, a lot of them, and I've talked with probably 24 Democrat legislators over the course of the last couple of years, Democrat legislators who say, yes, my constituents think property taxes are too high. And so let's just take that issue. I say, well, why do you think that's happening? And they'll say assessments, and I'll say, okay, let's talk about assessments. Let's talk about mill rate compensation, but let's also talk about unfunded mandates. Here are 300 unfunded mandates. Do you think your people might benefit from getting rid of some of those so that their property taxes will come down? I talk about income taxes. The Democrats have raised income taxes one year after the year after year after year. They just raised them again last year. And I talk economic policy. One of my graduate degrees is economics from Oxford. I go one by one and say, let me just ask you, do you think that your constituency do you think income taxes coming down might actually dramatically and favorably affect just your constituency? As an individual in those areas, I ask the same question. Do you want your property taxes down? Do you want your income taxes down without any dramatic effect on services, by getting rid of duplication, by getting efficiencies back, by getting rid of fraud, by getting rid of corruption? Do you want your energy costs down? Even if you like solar and wind power, and by all means, if you, Travis, want to fill your house, cover your house or your fields with it, that's all great. I just don't want you billing me for you to do that, okay? And I ask people, do you think that might be the perception of average people, that they can't afford to put all this stuff out there? They don't want their tax dollars going to it. They don't want net energy billing, which has increased their own tax rates, their own energy costs. And again, Democrats and unaffiliated voters say to me, yeah, it's true. I want the energy costs to come down. Do you want needles everywhere? Do you think it's okay to have 8,000 overdoses? Do you think that we owe a better commitment to people to get the drug traffickers out, to get good, effective addiction services in. Do you think a better relationship with the federal government, even if you hate Trump, do you think a better relationship with the federal government as a governor would help us to get that under control? Do you think that we ought to get our schools back on track so that our kids don't end up on the dole, but rather have a purposeful life? They get out feeling that they can envision, they can believe, and they can work for a dream like we were taught. And you know what? All across the board. And then the last question I ask is, do you think fraud and a questioning of the government for its integrity is a good thing for our overall Maine?
Let me guess, there's agreement on all those questions.
All those questions.
Yeah.
And that's it, Travis, right there.
I agree. I think social justice, I think the identity politics, they're done with that.
They're done with
Let's
it.
have someone like,
They're sick of
it
it.
seems like the common term we keep coming back to in this conversation, Bobby, is common sense. Let's return to common sense. I'll end with what you just said concerning reason. I like that you said that. Can we turn the reason switch back on? How biblical. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18, the Lord says through the prophet, "Come, let us reason together."
Yes.
So, Bobby, I know, again, time is of the essence for you. I am so grateful that you spent an hour with us here at the Pastor's Office podcast. Thanks for being here, my friend.
I am so grateful to you and all the people watching, because just by watching, you care about the future of the state. And I'll just say, this is our moment.
Yeah.
This is it. We either are equal to our time now, or we look forever backwards and say, why did I not step up?
Yeah. Well said. The Bible says that we are watchmen on the wall. And Bobby, I couldn't agree more wholeheartedly with you. God has called us to such a time as now, as being those representatives of what is true and fighting against that which is deception and evil. So I'm grateful for your time here. Listen, if this episode here at the Pastor's Office podcast, if it blessed you, if you're looking to get clarity on cultural, political, and certainly theological issues, subscribe, share. We know this is something that can produce change in the generations that are beyond us. Grace and peace to you.